What if I told you that a war once began, not with gunfire, but with silence between neighbors who stopped listening, between friends who let fear speak louder than love? The story of the Rughaniya War isn't just about what was lost, it's about how people found their way back to each other, one quiet act of courage at a time. There was a time, long ago, in a quiet valley nestled between rivers and mountains, where the people of Rughaniya lived. They had their stories, their music, and a way of life that bloomed with the seasons. But like many places in the world, peace can be a fragile thing. The Rughaniya War didn't start with shouting or marching. It started with silence. A silence that grew between people who stopped listening to one another. Misunderstandings became fears, and fears turned into fences. And before anyone realized it, there were lines drawn in the soil where friends once walked together. Children didn't understand why they had to run and hide. Elders remembered the old truce, the one made with clasped hands and kind eyes, and they wondered how it had been forgotten. The war wasn't loud every day, but it was always there, in the missing fathers, in the burned bridges, in the quiet meals at night, and yet, something soft and small began to grow. A little girl, with dark eyes and a brave heart, sent a drawing tied to a balloon across the dividing hills. A boy on the other side found it, and he smiled. He sent a song back, and the song traveled further than any arrow or fire ever could. It crossed fences and fears. Little by little, stories replaced swords. People began remembering what they had in common, not just the hurt, but the hope. The Rughaniya War may have taken many things, but it left behind something powerful, a reminder that even in the hardest times, kindness is a kind of strength. And peace, like any seed, grows best when tended gently, every day. So, when we remember this history, let us not only think of what broke, let us think of what was rebuilt by hearts that dared to open again. The Rughaniya War began not with weapons or bloodshed, but with a deep-rooted misunderstanding that grew quietly over time. The Rughaniya people lived in harmony for generations, guided by old customs and shared respect for the land they called home. Their neighbors, once allies in trade and celebration, began to change with the shifting winds of leadership and drought. Disputes over borders that had never been marked clearly on any map became serious. The sacred waters of the twin rivers, which both communities relied on for farming and rituals, became a point of contention. The Rughaniya elders believed the river was a gift from their ancestors, while the neighboring clan claimed that their survival also depended on its flow. These tensions were worsened by false stories that painted each side as greedy, cruel, or careless. Young warriors, fueled by pride and pain, began to question the old truce that had kept peace for decades. The elders tried to calm the rising anger, but the damage was done. Words once used for greeting turned into accusations. Cultural differences that were once celebrated became points of ridicule. One village built a wall, another banned visitors. With each small act of separation, trust crumbled. A small argument over a well turned violent when one group accused the other of poisoning it. That was the spark. By the time winter arrived, both sides had armed themselves. They no longer saw neighbors only enemies. What made the beginning of the Rughaniya War so tragic was how avoidable it seemed. The land had not changed. The rivers still flowed the same, but the hearts of the people, once open and generous, had been closed off by fear, pride, and the unwillingness to simply sit and listen to one another. The Rughaniya people and their neighbors had long honored a peace pact formed generations earlier, written not on paper but held in shared rituals, seasonal festivals, and the unspoken bond of coexistence. This pact was more than a treaty, it was a way of life passed down through songs, fire circle stories, and the respectful exchange of gifts during harvest. But as the years passed and younger leaders rose to power, the memory of that pact began to fade. The new generation, eager to assert strength and independence, began to see compromise as weakness. Small slights were interpreted as threats, and mutual patience gave way to suspicion. One day, during a seasonal gathering meant to renew the friendship between clans, a delegation from the neighboring valley failed to appear. Rumors spread quickly. Some said it was an insult, others claimed a secret plot to seize land. Without discussion, retaliatory actions began. Traders from the Rughaniya side were turned away at checkpoints. An ancient path used by herders was suddenly claimed and fenced. In response, the Rughaniya elders sent a messenger, hoping for calm, but he never returned. Some believed he had been imprisoned, others feared worse. That moment shattered what little remained of the old truce. A ceremonial drum, used only during peacetime rituals, was burned in a public fire as a symbol of defiance. The burning of the drum was witnessed by both sides, and what followed was the official declaration of war. Though no formal words were needed. The trust that once bridged to peoples had been replaced by fires of bitterness. What began as neglect and silence had now become action. The pact that once held generations together was gone, broken not by one large betrayal, but by countless small wounds left untended for too long. As the Rughaniya War unfolded, its impact was felt most deeply by those who had no voice in its beginning, the children and the elders. They were not the ones who held weapons or planned attacks, yet they bore the heaviest weight of the conflict. The children, once free to run through shared fields and gather at the riverbanks, now learned to move in silence. Laughter was replaced by whispers, and games turned into drills of hiding and surviving. Many families were forced to leave their ancestral homes, carrying only stories and heirlooms wrapped in cloth. Schools were closed, not because they were attacked first, but because teachers were called away to defend villages or flee with their families. In makeshift shelters, children drew pictures, not of sunshine and harvest, but of fire and soldiers. Their world had changed, and so had their innocence. For the elders, the war was a cruel mirror reflecting how far things had fallen. These were the men and women who remembered the old festivals, who sang the same lullabies to both Rughaniya children and those of the neighboring clans. They sat in circles, watching the fields where they once danced become battlegrounds. Their voices, full of wisdom and memory, were often ignored by younger fighters who saw tradition as weakness. Some elders tried to act as mediators, walking into enemy camps unarmed, offering bread and words instead of demands. A few were welcomed, but many were turned away, treated as relics of a forgotten time. Still, they persisted, holding on to what they could: rituals, prayers, quiet reminders that peace had once existed. In the hearts of both children and elders, the war left a silent ache, a longing not just for peace, but for the days when people still saw one another as neighbors instead of enemies. As the war dragged on, both sides began to feel the slow erosion of everything they had once valued. The Rughaniya warriors, who at first marched with pride and purpose, found themselves wearing not just in body, but in spirit. Battles were won and lost, villages taken and retaken, but the questions remained. What was truly being defended? What had been gained? Crops went unharvested. Livestock dwindled. The once thriving marketplaces became ruins of ash and memory. Families who had known each other for generations now lived as strangers, separated by fear and loss. There were days when soldiers stared across the battlefield and saw someone they had once shared bread with at a wedding or danced beside during the spring festivals. The lines of the conflict blurred with the passage of time. The reasons for fighting grew harder to explain to the younger generation, who were born into the war and knew nothing else. Among the ruins, both sides started to hear the quiet voices of doubt. Some began to question the leaders who had promised swift victory. Others started to feel the weight of the lives they had taken and the ones they had lost. Mothers grieved not only their fallen sons, but the sons of others too, knowing that pain had no boundary. The war had become a cycle, a pattern that repeated with no purpose beyond itself. Night after night, the songs sung in sorrow began to outnumber the songs of triumph. It was in those moments, as the smoke cleared and the silence grew heavier, that a new thought began to take shape, not of winning, but of ending. There was a growing awareness that the war, once believed to be necessary, had become a thief, stealing time, love, and all the small, beautiful things that once made life worth living. It was not generals or kings who began the healing, it was the children. In one village on the Rughaniya side, a young girl who had lost her father to the fighting sat beside a river and began humming an old song lullaby once sung by both sides before the war. The melody floated on the breeze, across the hills, and reached the ears of a boy on the other side, who recognized it. Though they had never met, they had learned the same song from different voices. That small echo of familiarity became the first thread in a new kind of connection. The boy replied with a different verse, one his grandmother had taught him, and this time he sang it loudly, hoping it would reach the girl. The next day, she tied a note to a wooden toy boat and sent it drifting downstream. Inside the note were words of kindness and a drawing of her family, those who remained. The boy sent back a carved bird, painted in the colors of both flags, and for the first time in years, something other than anger crossed the river. Word spread slowly. Other children, curious and hopeful, began exchanging small gifts, drawings, folded paper, with jokes and poems. These gestures were simple, yet powerful. Elders noticed and encouraged them quietly, remembering what peace had once felt like. Even a few soldiers laid down their weapons momentarily to witness these exchanges. Surprised by the innocence and bravery of the young ones, the wall of hatred, built tall over years of violence, began to show cracks not from force, but from kindness. It became clear that while weapons had brought fear, stories were bringing back humanity. Through these humble acts of sharing, the seeds of peace were planted where once only sorrow had grown. Long after the fires of the Rughaniya War were extinguished and the weapons laid to rest, the memory of the conflict remained. But what lingered most was not just the panic, was the transformation that followed. Both communities, once torn apart by suspicion and violence, began the slow and careful work of healing. At first, the steps were hesitant. Meetings were held under the watchful eyes of elders, where former enemies sat across from one another in silence. But over time, those silences turned into words. People began to speak, not just of battles, but of what they missed, the festivals that used to light up the valleys, the shared harvests, the laughter of children who once played together without fear. They shared stories of loss, and in those stories, they found mirrors of their own grief. Monuments were not built from stone or steel, but from acts of trust. One village invited another to help rebuild a broken school. Another sent food during a harsh winter, without expecting anything in return. These were quiet gestures, but they were loud in meaning. The children who had started the exchanges during the war grew into young leaders, shaping a new understanding of peace that wasn't about forgetting, but about remembering with compassion. Songs once banned during the war returned to the air, now sung with deeper meaning. Elders retold the history, not to reopen wounds, but to remind the next generation of what happens when we stop listening. They taught that healing isn't quick and that wounds, like the land itself, take time to mend. The legacy of the Rughaniya War became more than a cautionary tale, it became a lesson in the power of humility, empathy, and the quiet, everyday courage it takes to build peace from the ashes of conflict. The story of the Rughaniya War is not just about a time of pain and loss. It's about how, even in the darkest chapters of history, the light of understanding can still find its way through. It teaches us that war does not begin with weapons, but with broken trust, and that peace begins not with treaties, but with small, brave acts of kindness. From the silence of elders to the songs of children, from the ashes of villages to the rebuilding of hearts, the people of Rughaniya found their way back to one another. And in remembering their journey, not just the sorrow, but the healing, we're reminded that peace is always possible, if we choose to listen, to care, and to reach across the walls we build.